In a cave in the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq, archaeologists uncovered a skeleton that should not have existed. The man was blind in one eye. His right forearm had withered away decades before he died, the bone worn smooth from disuse. Arthritis had fused parts of his spine. By the time he died, somewhere around 45,000 years ago, he could barely have walked without help, let alone hunted, defended himself, or gathered his own food. And yet he had lived this way for years, perhaps a decade or more, in an Ice Age world where a single bad season could kill the young and the strong. Someone fed him. Someone kept him warm. Someone, almost certainly, carried him. Here is the question that should unsettle you. Nature does not usually work this way. In the wild, the old and the useless die quietly, and the group moves on without them. Evolution rewards the fit, the fertile, the productive, not the blind, the crippled, the exhausted. So why would a small band of hunter-gatherers, forever one failed hunt away from starvation, choose to keep alive a man who could give nothing back? That question opens onto something stranger still. Somewhere in our deep past, our species did something almost no other mammal on Earth does. We kept living for decades after our bodies stopped being able to reproduce. We kept our elders close, kept listening to them, kept organizing our lives around them. By the end of this film, you'll understand why menopause is one of the strangest puzzles in evolutionary biology. Why a handful of teeth buried in the earth can reveal exactly when grandparents entered human life, and why the survival of our entire species may once have depended on people who could no longer have children at all. Picture, for a moment, almost any other species of mammal. A female chimpanzee, a lioness, a deer. In the vast majority of cases, her reproductive life and her natural life end at roughly the same time. There is no long, healthy, decades-long epilogue. Nature, in its blunt arithmetic, has little use for a body that can no longer pass on its genes. And yet human women, healthy and active, routinely live 30, 40, even 50 years past menopause. In the entire animal kingdom, this pattern turns up in almost no one else, ourselves and a small number of toothed whales. Standing beside that fact, really looking at it, it starts to feel less like a footnote and more like an anomaly demanding an explanation. The investigation into that anomaly began, in part, not in a laboratory, but among the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last hunter-gatherer societies on Earth. In the 1980s and 90s, the anthropologist Kristen Hawkes and her colleagues followed Hadza women through the bush, timing how long they spent digging for wild tubers, counting how much food they brought back, and to whom. What they found was quietly extraordinary. The hardest working foragers in many camps weren't young mothers, tied down by nursing infants. They were grandmothers, post-menopausal women who no longer had children of their own to feed, yet who spent their days digging up food for their grandchildren. Hawkes proposed a name for this that has since become one of the more influential ideas in human evolution, the grandmother hypothesis. Children whose mothers had help, from grandmothers who kept working long after their own fertility had ended, could be weaned earlier and survive better. Mothers who weaned earlier could have their next child sooner. And so, generation after generation, natural selection may have quietly favored women whose bodies simply kept living and working long after childbearing stopped. But foraging behavior among living people is one kind of evidence. Teeth, buried for tens of thousands of years, are another kind entirely. The anthropologist Rachel Kaspari examined thousands of fossil teeth from sites spanning hundreds of thousands of years of human and Neanderthal evolution, using wear patterns to estimate age at death. Her research found something remarkable. For most of our evolutionary history, adults who survived into old age were rare, a small minority compared to those who died young. Then, around the time of the Upper Paleolithic, roughly 40,000 years ago, that ratio changed dramatically. Suddenly, far more adults were living into their grandparent years, and this shift arrives at almost exactly the same moment in the archaeological record as an explosion of something else entirely. Cave art, symbolic ornaments, long-distance trade networks, increasingly sophisticated tools. It is one thing to say grandparents helped feed children. It is another to suggest that the rise of the grandparent may be tangled up with the rise of culture itself. Which brings us back to the man in the Zagros cave. His name, given by the archaeologists who found him, was Shanidar I. He wasn't Homo sapiens, he was a Neanderthal, a species we once assumed to be brutish, incapable of the tenderness we like to imagine as uniquely ours. And he wasn't alone. Elsewhere, at a site called La Chapelle aux Saints in France, another elderly Neanderthal man was found who had lost nearly all his teeth years before death and shows signs of having survived on food that had been softened or prepared for him. These are not isolated curiosities. They are fossil evidence, hard, physical, undeniable, that caring for the old and disabled is not a modern invention, not a luxury of civilization. It runs back tens of thousands of years into a species we no longer walk beside. Here is where the story must be handled carefully, because it is tempting to reach for the comfortable version that these bands simply loved their elders, and that is the whole answer. It's a lovely thought, and it may well be part of the truth. But researchers are still genuinely divided over exactly why menopause evolved at all. The grandmother hypothesis is influential, not unanimous, and competing ideas exist about the balance of costs and benefits between generations of women in the same family. What the evidence does support, solidly, is this: societies that kept their elders alive gained something functional as well as emotional. And that distinction matters because it means compassion and survival were never really in competition. They were, very often, the same strategy. That functional value becomes even clearer in an unexpected place: the ocean. Killer whales are one of the only other species, alongside humans, known to go through menopause. Researchers studying orcapods off the Pacific coast of North America have found that post-reproductive grandmother whales often lead their pods to food, particularly in years when salmon are scarce, drawing on decades of accumulated memory about where to find prey when times are hard. Grandcalves with a living, non-breeding grandmother nearby have measurably better odds of survival, especially during those lean years. The females aren't valuable despite no longer breeding. In both orcas and, it seems, in early humans, they may have been valuable precisely because they had stopped, which finally answers the question the cave first raised, though not in the way you might expect. We assumed, at the start, that ancient bands must have carried their disabled and elderly out of pure sentiment, a kindness with no logic behind it. The evidence suggests something closer to the reverse. Those bands weren't sentimental despite the cost. They thrived because of what elders carried that nothing else could replace: ecological memory, hard-won knowledge, decades of accumulated experience about which plants were poison, where water hid in a drought, how to survive a winter no one currently alive had lived through before. A grandparent was, in the most literal sense, a library that could still speak. Groups who protected that library outlasted groups who didn't. Over enough generations, that difference is all evolution needs. So think again about the man in the Zagros cave. Blind, one-armed, and utterly dependent on people who owed him nothing, but chose to keep him anyway. He was not a burden his people carried, despite the odds against them. He may have been one of the reasons those odds ever tipped in humanity's favor. Every grandparent alive today is, in a quiet and literal sense, descended from people who were once judged worth keeping, which leaves an uncomfortable question hanging in a world where more and more of us grow old, apart from the families who once could not have survived without us. What exactly are we choosing to set down, now that we no longer have to carry it?